Yeah, thank you, Ted, and good afternoon, everyone, both here in the room and online. Good to see you, Gavin, on the screen. You look great. I'm sure the rest of you do as well on screen. So, and Ted, thank you for the opportunity, and thanks for pulling us together with the kind of the bifurcated avenues of information sharing. I'm sure you're well equipped to make that work just as well as it could if we were all together, and maybe that'll happen next time. John Jaschke, Executive Director, Board of Water and Soil Resources. I'm going to have them call up the PowerPoint here, and I want to make sure, you know, as Ted indicated, you know, my colleagues, Andrea's here, and Nicole, look forward to seeing you on screen too, to hear what you've been up to. We have gotten together, you know, it isn't like we worked in isolation for 2 years and now we're going to get to see each other for the first time. We actually got together on a tour this last summer, right, Ted? So that did happen, right, in the middle of all of this, in the wave of things as they go. So. I'll give you a few things on what has happened in Minnesota, and I look forward to hearing what is happening in other parts of the basin from my colleagues. So with that, you can run the PowerPoint. I don't see it, but I guess it's behind me, Ted, and that's the way this works. Okay, so I'll have to just kind of look to the side so I can remember what I was going to talk about. And I will flick the slides with this little thing right here. Is that right? Okay. All right. I'm not going to talk a lot about the whole COVID thing. I'll just say, you know, Dana can take a canoe with his father from Winnipeg to the Amazon and not worry about it too much and figure things out along the way. I guess we should all be able to do the same thing, right? So, Dana, that was really interesting. Thank you for being here to present that. You know, it does show that human ingenuity can sometimes carry a lot further than we sometimes think. Yeah, we had, you know, COVID, we had, you know, things that we had to do. We had policies we had to develop. You know, we did that as state agencies, you know, in some ways with our partners and a lot of times, sometimes, you know, on our own. You know, our federal partners, and Troy here is from our state conservation from Minnesota. You know, we work with them. We work with lots of local governments, obviously, as our agency structure is set up. We work with private sector interests as well. And so we all had different things we had to do and how we did them. But, you know, the one thing that was probably the common denominator is, like we're doing today, trying to work through technology to keep our work going forward. And I think that worked out really well. In some cases, some of it even got a little bit better, I would say. In other cases, we're going to have to catch up a little bit on some of the things that are harder to do when you're not together. But by and large, we were fully successful. Just a little bit about our agency. We work, all of our programs, you know, through statutes are driven through a local approach, through local governments, through counties and watershed districts and soil and water conservation districts and cities, and even a number of joint powers organizations of those statutory authorities. We focus on the private lands part of conservation and clean water work. Obviously, we have in Minnesota, particularly the northern part of the state, a great deal of public land, and the Forest Service and the DNR and others, you know, counties manage all those public lands, including, you know, parks and things like that as well. We focus on private lands conservation with private landowners, and that's why it's so important to have that local presence of a local conservation professional system to deliver those results. Our budget, just real quickly, is, you know, is basically shows the same thing, right? Most of our funding goes to the agency and then out to local governments and other partners to do the work on the ground. Some of that program work that we have to oversee, some of the regulatory programs for wetlands and buffers and things like that, we have to do directly, but even those programs have a very local component that also is part of the way the statutes are structured. So let me talk about watershed work. That has evolved in the last couple of years. In Minnesota, beginning 6 to 8 years ago, the legislature directed, you know, not in isolation, but working with agencies and local partners, we put together a policy that would transition us from, in essence, county boundaried water management to true watershed management. We, of course, had in the Red River Valley watershed districts and others that have been doing that for a long time, but this now became a statewide undertaking with a direction in law to accomplish that within 10 years. And so that time period is going to be expiring basically in 2025. And so the progress that we're making towards that goal is important. And here you can see on this map, It shows the status of those watershed areas. Those are not organizations necessarily. In fact, none of them are precisely lined up with any organization, including watershed districts, but they reflect a partnership in some fashion of formality. You know, either a written agreement that's short of a joint powers agreement, some kind of a collaborative arrangement, you know, whatever was up to that local combination of local governments is what came to be. So they start with coming together to do a plan, the plan using a lot of the information that has been prepared in the past, focused on water quality, certainly, you know, and the data that our agencies in Minnesota have collected and prepared are a part of that, and the models that support that, as well as a lot of information that also is collected at the local government's level. These become a plan that then has, you know, ownership via state approval first and then local adoption second, but it's a very grassroots process where citizens and things are involved in putting these plans together, because it's about taking action in the places that are going to give us the most public benefit. On the right there, you can see there's an example in the Red River Valley of an area that is including, you know, it shows the county boundaries and the watershed area that is part of that. And of course, counties, you know, have to now, instead of having which we used to have, you know, going back to the late 1980s, a county-based water plan, we now have a watershed plan. And so that means some counties, you know, many of the counties have multiple of them. I think Otter Tail County in the southern part of the Red River Basin, I think they told me they had 8 watersheds that they now have to figure out how to manage. But of course, they were doing that already, right? I mean, you do that work naturally, but this is making it a much more explicit arrangement. The other key part of this is that there is funding to follow this plan, right? I mean, putting together an action plan based on the best science that we have might be useful, but it's really useful if you have some way to then use that plan to accomplish the on-the-ground work that's going to either clean up the water or protect it from becoming impaired or becoming a problem. The state, as you know, I think has for now since 2008 had this legacy amendment in place, which is the biggest driver of the funding for this work. And you can see here, this is a trajectory that we are envisioning once the full number of plans has been completed and then the funding follows. You know, we're going to estimate that about 60% of this funding that comes through the Clean Water Fund would be dedicated to this work. And this means, you know, somewhere in the neighborhood right now, if we get to that number, it's about $250 million every 2 years. So if you're looking at 60% of that, that's the amount that would be directed to the work that these plans are prescribing as the priority things that need to be done. Of course, that all has to be, you know, prepared through a number of steps, starting with, in Minnesota, we have a Clean Water Council that makes recommendations to the legislature with, you know, input from the agencies. And of course, then the legislature has to pass bills or a bill to make all this real every 2 years typically. Here's some examples of those funding amounts in the most recent allocations. These are watershed areas within the Red River Basin of Minnesota, and these are the amounts that have been dedicated to these plans in these areas. It's driven by a formula that has to do with the watershed size and a few other variables. And this is then also, you know, being accomplished in other parts of the state. So these are amounts that are typically for about a 2-year period. The most important part of this is that it is planned to be predictable and ongoing. That was one of the key parts of this, that, you know, the grants and other funding that comes to the legislature, of course, is only available on a 2-year cycle. You can't promise something that the legislature hasn't yet, you know, passed, but the idea would be that they will continue to do that, and that these amounts would be something you can plan on, so you can start to, you know, identify projects, line up the you know, the designs, the permissions, the permits, the other resources that are important to get ready to go. And having those projects be, you know, being able to be planned before they can be funded is really important. And knowing they're going to be funded when they are planned is really, really critical. This is just one example. There's, thousands of them, and that's one of the important things that we've been trying to do more of, is to show people what the results have been. We can show the science that goes into these plans, and the way that land tells us, where the problems are and the solutions that need to be brought to bear. Here's an example, just, in Roseau River watershed, and there's lots of land that looks like this, right? And we've got land that's, very much important for production purposes, and many of these practices take place within these landscapes where you may not even know it's there, right? These rock inlets are one way to help protect our drainage systems from becoming a water quality problem, right? You keep the soil on the land, and you don't have the soil in the ditch, and you don't have the maintenance costs of cleaning out the ditch, and you don't have the water taking the soil downstream where the pollution is a problem. So that's the water side of it. The other thing that we've been spending some time on is the climate work. In Minnesota, the governor has commissioned a sub-cabinet that deals with the various aspects of climate change. It includes, kind of most all the agencies in some way, right? Because it cuts across energy sectors, transportation, environment, all of these things, housing, et cetera, right? So I will talk more about the specific parts that have to do with the natural and working lands and the water aspects. But this is underway and has been for about a year. We got started, just before the pandemic and took a pause because of that, but got everything back online and moving forward in the last year or so. There are two aspects, and the agencies work very closely together, on this, and also do a lot of work to get input from others, right? It's really important this be something that, lots of organizations and people buy into and understand first, and then hopefully are able to help do something about it, going forward. So you put these things in categories, right? I mean, and these are two of the categories that we kind of grouped: the natural and working lands, which, has to do with the landscape, that's both natural forests, lakes, streams, and the more working lands aspects, which have to do with our agricultural land primarily. And also there's a resiliency and adaptation team that has been looking at how we not only sequester carbon more so, but how to deal with the changes that the climate is bringing to us, and do it in a way that's well planned and well executed. And a lot of that has to do with infrastructure. And I'll highlight a few of those things. So health has been, obviously one of the key things. This practice of, cover crops and no-till is something that in Minnesota we're still learning more about. Not so much about what it is or how it works, but how to make it work here in Minnesota in our more northern climates, right? And our cropping systems, of course, are different than, the central part of the country. And of course, we also have various geography even within our own state. And of course, I'm sure the same is true for North Dakota and Manitoba as well. The good thing about this is if it's done well, and it's done for the long haul, you get, economic return on this, right? Not only for the person who owns the current property that's being farmed, but for the land that will continue to need to be used for cropping for the long haul, right? And that's going to be here forever, right? We're going to need to grow food and perhaps some fuel and the fiber too, on these lands. So we got to be able to do more than one thing with it. And this can really help. It also reduces inputs, right? And we've got programs in Minnesota that are, USDA based. NRCS has cost sharing in various forms. We have a demonstration program that we started in Minnesota, and we'd like to grow this. In fact, need to grow it a great deal, right? I mean, we know what to do. It's trying to find enough technical and financial assistance resources to help landowners do this, and not just, wonder about it, but try it for themselves, because it's a learning experience. It's a little bit like a gardening project that you haven't done before. If you haven't seen somebody else do it, you're kind of wondering about it, and seeing others do it and having farmer to farmer type knowledge transfer is a key part of being successful in this area. And so we're working to get additional funding to do both of those things, both in the technical and the financial assistance piece. And of course, if these things can be done different ways, we know about you know, the ability to grow these things, you know, after the harvest. Sometimes it can be planted, you know, prior to the full emergence of the crop. Sometimes, you know, grazing can be an option to help get some economic return in a different way on these lands. And so all of these things are pretty well known, but getting people to know it for themselves on the farm that they operate is really what is the key next step. And our Minnesota Extension Service has been doing a number of things in this area as well at the university. But there are some barriers, right? I mean, we still, I think according to the latest data we had from 2017, only about, you know, 2 or 3% of our land is in the cover crop practice, right? So we need to get people access to these tools, the technology, the equipment, those things. Of course, farmers are all now using, you know, data sets that are their own, you know, typically through crop advisors and others. And those are also pathways for us to explore, I think, more intentionally of getting those private sector information providers to help us get some of these landowners to try these things in a bigger way. I mentioned the University of Minnesota, we have a partnership with them. It also involves the the Department of Agriculture and NRCS also contribute to this endeavor, but getting it set up so the believable technology is from a place that's close enough to home. So this Minnesota Office for Soil Health is set up to do just that, to bring information that's credible, that's practical, and that's local enough so that people believe it'll work for them here in our state. I mentioned the demonstration program. We had 5 soil and water districts in Minnesota that took this on. We had a great deal of demand for it, but we had a limited amount of money to get started, but this has been successful. They have, you know, working with these producers to do this. We're focusing not on a 1-year arrangement, but typically a 3-year or maybe sometimes a little longer because, you know, the weather variability, you know, Ted talked about drought, right? I mean, some years when you have too dry or too wet or too something, you need to try it again next year when things are a little bit better, right? So making it work for the people who it needs to work for, the producers, is the key part of this. And so we'll be working on some of this going forward, potentially in the fiscal year upcoming. Our legislature begins in February, and there'll be some ideas, I think, that they will be given a chance to consider around this topic. Water storage is another issue. You know, the greater amounts of rain, or maybe the more intense amounts of rain, and maybe the same could be true of snow melt, I'm not quite sure about that, but you know, has meant that we have to do more to hold the water. We obviously have these lands that are, you know, been plumbed pretty well in most cases with the drain tile and ditching systems in our ag areas. You know, the same is true in our urban areas. You know, they've been lots of impervious surface, and the water is shunted from going into the soil and into the ground and being held that way to being directed directly into the channels. And so that makes it more difficult to keep that water from causing harm. So one idea is to hold the water in more places, to replicate nature in some ways, not replace what it once was there. I mean, we're not going back to the buffalo roamed, right? We're going to have our land used for things. And so how can we hold more water temporarily, even in some of these areas? And so, you know, and we get more benefits than just, you know, flood control, which you all know about a great deal here in the River Valley, but it also has a great deal to do with water quality, because an unstable channel, you know, causes erosion. Water washing off the land brings a lot more pollution with it than if it could be held there for a while. Real simple principles, but, you know, needing to be applied in many, many places. Here's one. This is not one in the River Valley. You can probably tell by the topography, but this is in southwestern Minnesota. Again, working with road authorities is one of the things that we think could be also helpful, because a lot of these areas, you know, have conveyance through a road system, and that can, if, you know, safety can be assured and so forth, and road stability, we can use that to help hold some water. And here's an example of right after the thing was built. And some of this water will stay there, some of it will move on, right? We also looked at areas where we have, you know, fully temporary storage, and I know those same principles have been used in flood control projects for many years as well. This one does have a, you know, a wet pond design, of course. You know, dynamic storage, not just holding water, you know, in the bathtub, but also having it take a longer route downstream can also create storage of a certain kind, right? I mean, so the water being slowed down while it's still moving is also one way to do that. And remeandering these channels is a key way that we can also accomplish that with, the benefits you also get with habitat and other things in water quality that go with these types of projects. And many of those have been tried, I know in Minnesota anyway, in the Red River Valley, and been very successful. And urban areas, of course, I mentioned those too. Holding these areas in specially designed spots here. It's a road median, where we can infiltrate, and a lot of these end up being almost invisible in the end because the water, if it's infiltrating into the subsurface and then being transmitted naturally or otherwise, down gradient, not downstream, people sometimes need signage just to know that something's actually even there. And so there's been a lot of these projects built in Minnesota cities.